Hey, this is Idea Coaches, the Coach East Rome. History of Japanese Mixed Martial Arts Part 2. Now, one thing I like to explain to you is that the reason that Japanese Mixed Martial Arts, as we remember it, was so elaborate and flamboyant was because a lot of the best fighters coming out of Japan during the early days of 97, 98, early 2000s were Japanese pro wrestlers. Now, when I say pro wrestler, I'm not talking about someone like a Rey Mysterio or a John Cena or The Rock or someone like that. I'm talking about catch wrestlers, something more akin to someone like Josh Barnett. You know, Funaki was one of the best fighters in the late 90s coming out of Japan. And then, of course, Sakuraba coming around, you know, for the Grand Prix of 2000. Now, this history part is going to cover from the inception of Pride all the way up until the inception of PRIDE Bushido, where they introduced all the lower weight classes. Now that is a lot of history to cover because I'm covering 6 years of Japanese mixed martial arts in roughly 8 minutes. So without further ado, let's get into the history of Japanese MMA, part 2. In the mid-90s, Nobuhito Takada was the head of the UWF, a Japanese pro wrestling organization that decided it'd be more profitable to have matches with its main rival, New Japan Pro Wrestling, and give the fans dream matchups. Within that time, both companies made a large sum of money. Remember, it was not known that Pancrase, Shudo, New Japan, or the UWF was predetermined. The facade was created because in pro wrestling there's a thing called strong style. That's where the kicks, hits, and slams are used with real force behind them. This is not really seen in major American wrestling promotions, but in Japan, nearly all wrestlers outside of the Lucha Libres use strong style. Edson Inoue, Japanese-American Pride, UFC, and Shudo veteran, surprised himself that these fights that was taking place in New Japan and the UWF were not real. He didn't understand this until he tried to become a fighter himself. So after the New Japan Pro Wrestling and UWF rivalry was over, the question the Japanese matchmakers had was what were they going to do next? The Gracie name came up. Hoist was negotiating compensation and special rules, something we'll talk about later. Rickson Gracie was the man chosen to face Takada. Pride was born in 1997. This, like the first UFC event, was to be only a one-off show. The idea of having different styles match up against each other was something that was very popular in the 90s. Most of the first Pride event featured other Japanese pro wrestlers as well. Perhaps taking cue from the then WWF and WCW, Pride had more pyrotechnics, and they even had a drum orchestra, something that was unique to the Japanese combat sporting events at the time. Rickson Takada fell into the same category as Inoue versus Muhammad Ali and Kimura versus Ricky Dozan, where there'll be huge game-changing bouts that are essential to the future of Japanese mixed martial arts that would go on to sell very well and be very famous for years to come. But overall, the fight was born itself. Pride 2, 3, and 4 had pro wrestling promos at the end of their shows to lead to the next event. Takada and Tamura was going off against a Japanese judoka named Inoue. That actually those fights never took place in Pride, even after Inoue predicted the funeral of both of those guys. Dream Stage took over after Pride 4 and gave it a TV deal with Fuji TV. Even though Pride started to linger away from its pro wrestling setup, it didn't find its real theme until the Grand Prix that took place 3 years after the first event. Before that, they had kickboxing matches in Pride 2, which is probably an attempt to be an answer to the K1 reign of dominance in combat sports at the time. A Brazilian jiu-jitsu demonstrations by Hoyer and Rickson Gracie in Pride 5, and a straight karate match in Pride 6. This version of mixed martial arts is more of a celebration of martial arts as a whole, and it exposed and educated its audience in other forms of combat. I'm not saying that the UFC should run shows like this at all, but having that element in maybe the Ultimate Fighter TV series would bring the show back to life. There's a huge influx of foreign fighters in Pride. There are no exclusive contracts, so the Japanese fans got to see K1 stars, sumo wrestlers, catch wrestlers, and some UFC faces, and of course Japanese mainstays, all under one roof. When it comes to the UFC fighters having to go to Japan for jobs, many people blame Senator John McCain for being so against MMA and having it banned in 37 states, which is like a huge chunk of their pay-per-view buy market, by branding it human cockfighting. Few seem to blame the UFC's marketing team and how they presented their product at the time. No rules, and various montages of blood and violence with little to no mention of the actual competitors' legit martial art rankings. The UFC at the time was trying to appeal to the ECW market, a pro wrestling promotion in the US that was more about sex and violence than wrestling itself. There were even actors in the crowd during these early UFC events that were paid to give each other high fives when a decent finish took place. PRIDE 7 was the debut of Wanderlei Silva, the first Brazilian that was not directly connected to the Gracie family, although much later he received an honorary black belt from the Gracie family. Speaking of that, PRIDE 8 saw the first defeat of a Gracie family member by Kazushi Sakuraba. The timing of his rise could not have been better. With Takada's spotting skills in serious question, the famous pro wrestler from Kingdom and the UWF was just coming off great wins in the UFC's heavyweight tournament, and now he was the first guy to beat a man with the last name of Gracie in mixed martial arts. Skip forward. Let's have a Grand Prix. The combination of money drying up in the States had many fighters heading to Japan for a job in good conditions. The first round had an audience of about 50,000 people. However, it was lackluster. So much so that it got to the point where the PRIDE PR firm had to do a public voting tally to see who was going to face each other in the next set of matchups. Much to the dismay of the other fighters competing, such as Mark Kerr and Mark Coleman, the Gracies somehow negotiated a deal where the bouts would be done with no time limits. The semifinals and finals were held on May 1st, 2000. You know the story. Mark Kerr was a disappointment. Sakuraba became a legend by demystifying the Gracies. Mark Coleman won the whole thing, and in some ways was the first man to hold a belt in both PRIDE and the UFC. But more importantly, PRIDE made waves on an international scale. With Sakuraba's rise to stardom, Pancrase and New Japan, both competitor organizations, were having a hard time keeping up. PRIDE was also running more events at this time. In 2001, they ran 6 events, but in 2002, they ran 10. Now, most of these bouts were still in that quasi-open weight format of the Grand Prix, but that was quickly changing. A lot of their success came through sheer luck of fighting stars who were just coming back to back. First, when PRIDE started, it was Takada and the Gracies carrying the flag. Then it was Sakuraba. Then it was Wanderlei Silva. When the Axe Murderer beat Sakuraba the first time in March of 2001, many chalked it up to be just a lucky punch. In November of the same year, there was a rematch that left no one thinking luck had anything to do with Silva's dominance. Production values themselves were getting higher. One thing I personally love about Japanese mixed martial arts was that the viewer would get some insight into the fighter's personal side. We already know that they train and fight. Those videos were always combined with music that just seemed to match the tone of the relationship between the fighters, or at the very least, give a so-so fight more weight than it's worth. That is a sign of a good promoter. In 2003, PRIDE started to see the potential in lighter weights from Judo, which would later become a feeder to PRIDE's roster. They decided to start PRIDE Bushido. The Bushido events had heavyweight bouts here and there, but was mostly focused on welterweights and lightweights. This could not have been a better time to get the best fighters because the UFC dropped the entire lightweight division completely after the then lightweight champion Jens Pulver left the UFC, and the match to determine the new champ, BJ Penn and Kyle Inoue, was a wreck. Pulver went off to PRIDE and ran into some difficulties in his success. A similar situation happened to Murilo Bustamante, who was the UFC's middleweight champion in 2003 when he left the company. Join me next time. We'll be discussing the rise of the Fireball Kid Takanori Gomi, K1 Heroes, and the other Grand Prix that PRIDE put on. Subscribe. Take care.